first years of the American presidency, serving as Secretary of State was the stepping stone to the White House. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe had blazed that trail. In 1824, John Quincy Adams stood to follow. But in this historic election year, other ambitious men wanted the job.
You have a Treasury Secretary, William Crawford. Got a Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. In Congress, you have the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay.
And there's also a rising national hero, Andrew Jackson, the victor of New Orleans, Old Hickory. Tremendously popular, very, very popular.
Significantly, 1824 was the first election in which states began to count the popular vote in presidential elections. This meant that a national candidate could accurately measure his popularity with the common man. In 1824, Andrew Jackson was the clear choice of the people. But the presidency was still directly decided by the Electoral College, and that race was too close to call.
The way the four of them finish in the Electoral College is Andrew Jackson is first, John Quincy Adams is second, William Crawford is third, and Henry Clay is fourth.
But Andrew Jackson does not get a majority of the electoral votes.
Now, according to the Constitution, the top three go to the House of Representatives, which must pick among them. So Clay is dropped. But of course, Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The unknown quantity in this election is Henry Clay.
Then William Crawford had a stroke. So the contest came down to two men, Adams versus Jackson, with Henry Clay presiding from the pulpit of the House of Representatives.
Clearly, some deal was made. The House picks John Quincy Adams on the first ballot, and John Quincy Adams picks Henry Clay as the Secretary of State. Now, Andrew Jackson screams bloody murder at this, and he says this is a corrupt bargain.
It is a scandal. It is a scandal. And John Quincy Adams enters office under this terrible cloud of this corrupt bargain.
Shortly after his election, John Quincy Adams received a note from his father. It said, "No man who ever held the office of president would congratulate a friend upon obtaining it." Number 6, John Quincy Adams, Democratic Republican, 1825 to 1829, 57 years old, from Massachusetts. Adams came into office with many lofty goals. He wanted Americans to explore the Western territories. He wanted to fund public education. He promoted scientific advancement and discovery. And he proposed vast internal improvements, such as roads and canals across the nation.
Now, the problem is he doesn't get to do any of it because the politics of his term are just so rancid, and he is so unable to manage them.
Before the oath of office had fully passed his lips, Congress began thwarting everything Adams wanted to do. This would haunt his presidency and leave Adams with few accomplishments.
I think it's fair to say that the Jackson followers in both the House and the Senate wage a war of obstructionism in the 4 years that follow. And so it's a very ill-fated presidency.
Adams' personality did nothing to help his presidential agenda. Yes, he was the son of a founding father and acutely aware of it. But he was also his father's son.
John Quincy Adams tends to be somebody with a very strong self-righteous streak.
Adams was physically short, pudgy, and stubborn like his father. And like Lyndon Johnson, he was a skinny dipper, although Adams took his morning swim in the Potomac River.
He was also the first president to wear long trousers instead of knee breeches.
John Quincy Adams came to the White House, much like George W. Bush did 175 years later, hoping to exorcise his father's political demons and retrieve a lost presidency.
It's not as if he went into it by saying, I can do a better job than my dad by being more diplomatic or whatever. Quite the contrary. It was more like, I'm going to prove to those guys that my father was right. And of course, he went down the drain the same way his father did.
More than anything, John Quincy Adams believed he could rise above the charge that he had gained the presidency through a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay.
He did not worry about whether he himself had been corrupt, and I think that was part of his undoing.
Seeking to prove his political purity, Adams refused to play the patronage game in Washington. This meant he would not hire people who were for him or fire those who were against him. The result was devastating.
John Quincy Adams endures probably 4 years of what may be the most miserable presidency that any president has ever experienced. It is 4 years of unremitting attacks on him by the Jacksonians.
In 1828, John Quincy Adams ran for a second term. But once again, Andrew Jackson stood in his way. In this election, American political opinion was sharply split. Those for Adams, who believed he deserved 4 more years, and those for Jackson, who believed their man had been robbed in 1824, the victim of the corrupt bargain.
The one person who believed the charges absolutely, utterly, was Andrew Jackson himself, and he went home swearing eternal revenge, and he got it.
The election of 1828 was the dirtiest campaign in history. I don't think there's any question about that. It was brutal.
Jackson campaigned on his impressive war record. He was the hero of New Orleans, the conqueror of Florida, and a bona fide veteran of the American Revolution. But Jackson's past also included some unsavory behavior, which the Adams camp brazenly exposed.
They accused him of being a gambler, a military tyrant. John Quincy Adams called him a barbarian.
In this contentious election, character was the main issue.
The people on each side did everything they could to smear the character of the other man.
And in the case of Andrew Jackson, they are really beyond the pale. They attack Jackson, and they attack his wife, Rachel. And the attacks on Rachel Jackson are really merciless.
The dirt on Rachel was that she had married Jackson in 1791 before obtaining a legal divorce from a previous marriage. The charge was true, but so old that no one expected it to be an issue. But then, in the heat of the campaign, a Cincinnati newspaper published the damning story.
When that Cincinnati editor exposed the details of the fact that Rachel had lived in bigamy and that Andrew had lived in sin, you know that it tore his soul. He blamed Henry Clay for that. Henry Clay was a close friend of the editor, and while Clay denied it, Jackson never believed the denial. So he despised Clay for the corrupt bargain, but came to despise him even more because of that attack on his wife.
The Jackson people responded with equally outrageous charges against Adams.
They would reply that he lived with his wife before they were married. He provided a young American virgin for the pleasure of a Russian czar. He bought a pool table for gambling devices, broke the Sabbath.
Important issues concerning government were ignored. Instead, campaign rhetoric focused on the personal lives and character flaws of the candidates.
What kind of a human being do you want to be in the White House? Do you want somebody whose wife is a whore, which is essentially what they accused Mrs. Jackson of being? Or do you want somebody who pimped for the Tsar of Russia, which is what they said that Adams had done?
I have to say this. The things that the Adams people said about Jackson were mainly true. The things that the Jackson people said about Adams were lies.
In this election, the truth hardly mattered. Jackson's popularity with the common man proved to be overwhelming, and he won in a landslide. But the joy of victory didn't last. In December 1828, after buying her inaugural gown, Rachel Jackson died, suddenly, of a heart attack. She was 61 years old. This was a cruel blow to Jackson, and it would shape his presidency.
Andrew Jackson is reputed to have remarked on the occasion of her death that he did, in fact, forgive all those who had attacked him personally, but that he would never forgive those who had attacked his wife.
As for John Quincy Adams, he, like his father, was not gracious in defeat. He refused to attend Jackson's inauguration. Instead, he went home to Massachusetts. 2 years later, Adams was elected to the House of Representatives, becoming the only former U.S. president to do so. In this role, Adams would be an outspoken congressional leader in the fight against slavery. That work, not his presidency, would become his greatest legacy. John Quincy Adams is the first president to have his photograph taken. He sat for this photo in 1843.